So in April 2018, just last year, at the time we was writing the book, the Canadian Standards Association, along with the International Code Council, published a brand new standard called CSA B805, rainwater harvesting systems. And I've been told that this standard will be referenced in the 2020 National Building Code. Let's have a peek at what they're saying about water quality and how they're framing this whole, recommendations around ensuring end of line or end use water quality. There's a table 8.1, and this is what they're saying the treatment is required based on the end use for roof harvested single family homes. So quickly, I'll just walk through it. And the way this particular standard is being structured is they've got on the left-hand side these end-use tiers, and there's 1, 2, and on the next page there's 3 and 4. And these end-use tiers correspond to this category, non-potable versus potable, and they've got this potential, I think it's a risk potential for human contact, low, medium, and high, and some examples of uses. And with that, they come up with these 4 different end-use tiers. And then there's 2 parts to this table that one of them is this minimum performance criteria, where they've indicated a log reduction, viruses, bacteria, protozoa, and pH. Sometimes there's none indicated, and then they've got percentages. And then alternatively, I believe this is an either or, a minimum prescriptive requirements, where they provide, if you're not going to meet these minimum performance criteria, they're saying you can pick one of these options off of this table for the particular end use you're designing the system for. What do you see here, Peter? What kind of jumps out at you in terms of thoughts? And
jumps out at me is the minimum performance criteria is very much a water utility treatment plan design criteria that has no relevance at all to a small system rainwater harvesting design. So log reduction, well, firstly, viruses are extremely difficult to discover in water, and they are also, the tests for these are quite unreliable, and there are many different types of bacteria that are in environmental waters that are not dangerous, and bacteria, the key bacteria that you would want to discover in for a safe rainwater system is very difficult to accurately describe and test in the laboratory. The protozoa is almost impossible. So you can do it, say, on a big wastewater treatment plant or a big water treatment plant where the inflow quality is quite poor, even say for river water. But in rainwater harvesting, the potential numbers of any of these things are so low that the log reduction idea makes no sense. So, bit of maths here. So,
I mean, where my question to you is, if you were going to try to meet the minimum prescriptive requirements, and granted, I should say I haven't read this standard from cover to cover, but I don't think that there's any information in terms of where you're testing your start point either, right? Because in order to measure a reduction, you need to say the starting point to your end point and measure the reduction from across that those 2 points.
yeah, I agree, Michelle. So, if I could go back to the log reduction thing, say there's just one count of something. A log reduction of 1 is 0.01. So it's 0.1. And 2 log reductions is 0.001. Impossible to measure, impossible to prove. So if you have low counts of anything, notwithstanding that the testing methods are not overly reliable in this sort of water for this.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but the log reduction process makes no sense when you're starting with very low numbers or no numbers.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's this issue that you've quite rightly raised. The water quality depends on where you test in the rainwater harvesting system. So we have lots of trouble in Australia where people say, oh, they just grab a grab sample through the top of the storage, and all they're sampling is the water surface micro layer, which we're talking about in the treatment train part of this course, um, where anything that might be in the water stays at that layer, and that will not be at your point of supply. So if you if you're not testing in the right place, you get completely different answers as well. So if you're testing for drinking water, you better test at the drinking water tap, not at some obscure place in at the top of the rainwater storage or somewhere else.
Yeah, and the good news with this standard is I'm quite positive they talk about always testing at the location of use for the end point. Um, but back to if you as a designer want to go for the minimum performance criteria instead of the minimum prescriptive requirements, how do you like one question that is in my mind is how do you even navigate this log reduction, or where's your what do you choose as your starting point? And that's where this, I guess, starts to.
It seems to have this assumption that there'll be excessive counts of everything in rainwater, which simply don't exist, but do exist in utility treatment plants, but they don't exist in rainwater harvesting systems. If we take you to end use tier 2, it's called non-potable, but
Mhm.
medium for potential for human contact. Let's
Yeah.
examine this a little bit. And we had this in Australia where a water utility microbiologist tried to tell me that rainwater was so dangerous that if you got it on your skin, it would make you very sick. So, okay, whenever it rains, let's just stay inside the house because that's going to be, uh, you know, a danger to us. Well, no, that's definitely not the case. There's some quite illogical assumptions here in this negativity about rainwater. So potential for human contact isn't really a risk.
Oh,
They have to,
you're looking at oh, okay, the potential for human contact isn't a risk, right?
yeah. It's assumed to be there. So if if you've got contact with rainwater, it's not a risk, but this table assumes it is. Then it gives examples of uses. Um, So I'm sorry, toilet and urinal flushing is definitely not a risk. We got over that many years ago in Australia where it was assumed someone might drink out of the toilet system. Therefore, flushing it with rainwater was dangerous. And, a logical person would say, maybe how you've used that toilet system has got far more contamination.
Right. And I was visiting Rob where he works, and they've got one of the few rainwater systems in Calgary in a commercial building for toilet flushing. And you go into the washroom and there's this huge sign on top of the toilet advising users to not drink the toilet water
And
because
can
it's
I
like rainwater. It's not possible.
So that's in the completely wrong category there. It's a low potential for human contact, but then they've applied on the other side of that. Oh, it might create aerosols, and it might make you sick. Oh, well, no, wrong pathway. So what you're concerned about in the toilet is, you know, fecal contamination. If someone is ill and they've gone to the toilet, they have to be ill first, by the way. They're just pathogens aren't magically in poo. The person who has defecated needs to have an illness for it to be in the poo. So there's a range of issues that are not considered here, but there's also a completely complete misunderstanding of the pathway of potential risk. If they're assuming aerosols, it can't possibly come from flushing the toilet. And again, the use of the toilet when you flushed it and generating aerosols would be um, of different quality than the actual flushing water. So that's irrelevant. But let's talk about the actual infectious diseases pathway. If we could be professional about this for just 1 minute.
Yeah,
I'm
for
trying.
sure.
I'm trying not to be because it's an absurd concept. So if we say, oh, there might be aerosols from the toilet, but we're basing that on fecal bacteria, which are only a risk to us by ingestion, like by drinking, not by breathing in. So there's not an aerosol risk in this source. And in fact, further down, you've got evaporative coolers and so on. Now, the aerosol risk, assumed risk, perceived risk, is related to Legionella. Now, Legionella is ubiquitous, common to all water, but completely harmless until you heat it up to blood temperature and you make it viable, which happens in cooling, large cooling towers and hospital warm water systems. They run warm water systems in hospitals at just above blood temperature because they don't want to scold old people and infirm people in the hospitals. So the only real cases around the world of outbreaks from Legionella, and Legionella is a harmful process. It's in hospital warm water systems or where there's cooling towers or heating water to blood temperature process involved. Because Legionella is a very fragile bacteria. It doesn't like the cold, doesn't like the heat, is only viable when it's incubated, say in a cooling tower, warmed up and heated at blood temperature. Um, so it's only viable in a small range of temperatures
Mm.
and is not viable in any other. So in these cases, for toilet and urinal flushing, either by aerosols or by drinking, there's no logic in that.
What about the risk of skin contact? Because there also seems to be this perceived, this potential for human contact. They're not talking about potential. They seem to have lumped in the potential to consume, the potential for aerosols, and I'm presuming that the potential for skin contact of rainwater, right?
Yeah, and as I said before, the contact of rainwater is completely harmless, and assuming there is a problem with it, this table suggests, seems as if they've confused rainwater with chemicals from, say, a chemical plant or.
So if there's viruses and bacteria, no, and here's where you're going to correct me. Legionella, which you mentioned earlier, is a bacteria.
So what this standard is about, it's a really good point, Michelle, because if you're concerned about chemical or metals or other physical contamination of rainwater systems, there's nothing here that will actually make any difference. UV, chlorination, or ozone will not actually change that issue at all. They
Right.
will
If it's like lead contamination, none of those post storage treatment options are going to do anything to remove lead.
The only one that will actually, in this deemed to comply part of the table, is filtration.
Okay, yeah, like a carbon filter or something.
Or say like in my own house, a zero point 0.1 micron filter on my drinking water tap.
Considered
Well,
ultrafiltration.
ultrafiltration, it's got carbon and silver in there as well. It's really inexpensive and really good, but I only have it on my drinking water tap. But it will take out everything organic and inorganic, so chemicals, metals, and bacteria and viruses. I guess these, for the types of viruses and bacteria and protozoa that they claim might be in rainwater, you've got to have higher order mammals defecating on your roofs, because this story is about roof harvested rainwater. So humans,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
cows, um, because that's where these things might come from if these animals are ill. And I really haven't seen cows on my roof, and
Well, but that begs a really common question I get, which is, well, what about birds defecating on my roof? Won't that make me sick? Won't that make me really sick?
so um, the bird thes- thes- thesis is like a second order process. So the main risks is coming from higher order mammals, and the EN Health guidelines in Australia, written by our National Health and Medical Council, highlight that the birds are bird poo is a secondary consideration, a secondary stream of things that might make you sick. Again, the potential pathogens associated with bird poo are extremely fragile. So, Campylobacter is common in birds and chicken, by the way, if you don't cook it properly. Um, and when they poo on your roof, that bacteria doesn't like UV light, doesn't like cold, doesn't like heat. It's extremely fragile, and it needs to also stay moist. So if they defecate on your roof is subject to a range of processes where there's UV light from the sun, natural UV light, there's wind, there's drying forces, and by the time that um, any part of that bird poo is washed off into your rainwater harvesting system, there's potentially not much, if any, left of any residual bacteria that might have been in that bird poo. However, and then we have a treatment train in your rainwater harvesting system that is very good at eliminating those sorts of fragile bacteria. This is a natural treatment train. So, and then our human systems are actually very good at eliminating small numbers of bacteria as well. Extremely good. We've got acids in our mouth and throat and stomach. So assumptions about. I've heard a lot of assumptions about bird poo, but no, not really. So lizards and birds can also carry salmonella, but not all the time, but sometimes. In the case of lizards, frogs, and birds, if they don't have direct access to your stored water, same with Campylobacter, you're very unlikely to have that contamination in your system. So your good rainwater harvesting design, if you've got screens on your inlets and outlets, frogs and lizards can't crawl in and the birds can't land on your water surface and defecate on it, your direct link to contamination doesn't exist. So
Mm. I want to talk a little bit more about. I'm going to pull up the second page of the table. You've been talking about it with the potable, kind of this perspective on any water intended for consumption on this table 8.1. And they've got these log reductions that you could possibly achieve, but they do provide these prescriptive requirements similar to the standard 63 that gave us the three options: the UV, chlorine, and ozone. The CSA standard has an additional, or a fourth, I guess, option, which is this microfiltration or ultrafiltration, which I was really happy to see. And I know that's an approach that you mentioned earlier is what you put on your own drinking water tap.
we should actually examine a few things here. They've got pH in this table, and it seems like there's a misunderstanding of pH, because the natural pH of rainwater is 5.5, but that slightly acidic water is not the same as if there's a chemical or contamination in water. Um, Rainwater, because of its natural chemical mix, is naturally slightly acidic, um, and which is quite different to say water in say, a utility water supply that might have other chemicals involved in it, like chlorine, for instance, that will make it acidic. So it doesn't have a resilient chemical in it that's actually making it acidic and therefore corrosive. It's just natural. It's the natural chemical mix of rainwater. Obviously, if you're in an area with atmospheric pollution, that um, you can get down to threes and fours in your pH. But what we find, because that pH is quite unstable in rainwater, because it's not a physical contamination that's creating that pH, like hydrochloric acid or something in the water.
Mhm.
So as it passes through a rainwater storage, it has a balancing effect on pH, and you're coming out around the 6.5s by the time you get to the tap. So I saw on the potable standard this 7 to 10.5 pH, which is really a water utility pipe infrastructure pH, nothing to do with health. pH is not a health standard, um, and it's borrowed heavily from water utility thinking. The reason why they need a neutral pH with utility water systems is they're adding a chemical cocktail to make water safe and acceptable. Um, and to get the right chemical reaction with the 20 different chemicals they're adding to mains water, you have to have a neutral pH, or else the biochemical reactions in your utility water supply is going to do different things. This is quite different to rainwater. We don't need to do this with rainwater, so I
Yeah,
don't know.
the implication here in this table is almost is that you should test and monitor and adjust the pH in your rainwater to be within this range. And and you know, I must admit, when first getting into this, I had assumed it was a health reason, but
No, it's not.
yeah,
So
it's not.
it's not a
There
health.
is there does tend to be one of the counter arguments I've heard is around, your piping and distribution. But again, you have you ever tested for pH in your home rainwater harvesting system and adjusted for pH?
I've never adjusted for pH. My
Mhm.
own home is 20 years of monitoring, so we
Oh, of
know what
course. You've
we
tested extensively.
yeah we know what's going on, Michelle. But getting back to the OEN health guidelines that are written by our, our, our National Health and Medical Council, um, they don't recommend testing rainwater at all because it's counterproductive and misleading, and a rainwater harvesting system is not a utility water treatment plant. Um, so it's pointless testing because, as we pointed out earlier on, one and all these characteristics, the laboratory testing can be quite confusing and misleading for an environmental water like rainwater. Um, you There's a high potential of false positives for coliforms and E. coli, for example. 20 to 30% in the literature. There's even when you do get E. coli, there's at last count 32 species of E. coli that are actually environmental E. coli, nothing to do with whether or not there's poo in the water, and nothing to do and harmless to humans. So
That's
you,
completely misunderstood. I didn't even realize that until you pointed that out to me.
so
Um, you
you
hear
get
E. coli and automatically alarm bells are going off, right? In terms of, wow, you
well
gotta do something. Don't you know?
in for a treatment plant supplying 4 million people in a city, uh, they have to be overly conservative because if they get something wrong, they could make 4 million people sick.
Mm.
Say a decade or so ago in Milwaukee, 400,000 people were sick because of cryptosporidium in the water. Um, Mains water system So if they get something a little wrong, the potential to make a lot of people sick. So you get many levels of factors of safety applied, um, and in some cases that aren't warranted. In the other cases, they are warranted. So
So this
in this,
ties back perfectly to our conversation on systems and those systematically misleading assumptions, I suppose, where you're applying the same thinking and perception of the solution or the problem, or I should say solution space, but on totally different scales, right? And with completely different risk profiles.
and a completely different physical process going on. So applying thinking, which this table does, from a water utility large treatment plant to a rainwater harvesting system is like putting tractor tires on a go-kart. It's just trying to hammer in a tack with a sledgehammer. It's just the wrong fit. So the recommendation, and there's another reason for this recommendation, there shouldn't be testing because it's just completely misleading in the EN health guidelines, is that we had Hayworth and then Rodriguez who did these national epidemiological studies with of children and people, and they found that people drinking untreated rainwater were less likely to be ill than those who are drinking utility water. And then, of course, the utility sector didn't believe those studies. So we've had 15 studies since, and they've all found the same thing. So these are the most credible of health studies. And the way they work is if there's something wrong, people will be sick, right? And if they're not sick, why not? So when you actually measure thousands of people, those with drinking mains water and those drinking rainwater untreated, and across a long period of time, you can actually, the only real credible test is, oh, is one group of people more sick than the other? And they couldn't find that in these 15 studies. And in fact, they found that people in rainwater were better off, which annoyed some. The way they tested that is by measuring how often people got gastrointestinal illness. That means they got the trots, they had diarrhea, and they had those sorts of symptoms, which would be created by, microbial or contamination, viruses, bacteria, protozoa. So um, that's also happened in our country, but we're lucky in our country because we have such a long history of people just drinking untreated rainwater. So we got a strong evidence based. Everywhere else in the world, they don't have a strong evidence based. So it's very opinion based. We also have to be aware of those who write on behalf of utilities who sell water, write that rainwater is very bad, right?
Well, at
Yes.
least it seems in North America, particularly, and I'm more familiar there. Um, there's this tendency, or we tend to have codes and standards that we are advised or are legislated even to follow. And what you're pointing out here is a lot of times the thinking that went into designing those codes and standards were really coming from this perspective of the utility, the same way that they would think about utility water supply applied to home scale rainwater harvesting systems.
Absolutely. And it doesn't make a lot of sense, really.
So how is it in Australia in terms of guidelines or codes and standards around rainwater harvesting systems? What is the published information that designers that are just getting into this, what are they going to reach for when they're looking at how to put together a system like this?
So the first thing, well, they don't have tables like this because our EN health guidelines have said they don't make any sense for rainwater harvesting. But so that's the most credible guideline in the country, possibly the world. And but what they do say is your common sense applies. So we've had a lot of common sense management of rainwater harvesting for a millennium, or not a millennium, a century in Australia. And how it works is your water clear and it should not smell? So clear and no smell, therefore it's probably going to be okay. They're the first two checks. So at the point of use, is the water clear and it should not smell? And that's what our national guideline says. Then there's don't have tables like this. We have other codes which can be bypassed in our country because standards are not legally binding. A lot of people don't realise that. So, and in fact, in our High Court, if you're an engineer and you say, I designed something and I just relied on the code and something goes wrong, you could be found to be criminally and professionally negligent because you're supposed to not design to the code, but design to your professional knowledge using the best practice available. So, people make codes, but they're based on their perception. I suspect from what you were telling me, Michelle, there's a different paradigm going on in North America. There are other guidelines, put out by health departments, the Rainwater Harvesting Association of Australia, which I sent to you.
I'll put a link to the EN Health guidelines as well as a link to where to find Standard 63 and B808. Why am I remembering 805? The CSA one in below the video here for everyone. And anything else, any other related ones, we'll throw links to.